Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, this was a video that was actually recommended to me in our video recommendations over on Discord. And many of you know, if you have been around the channel for very long, that one of the topics I'm quite passionate about is the study of the monarchs of the United Kingdom. And so this one caught my attention, and it's the top 10 worst kings and queens of England. Now, I understand that some people are going to take issue with that title because, at least in modern times, there is no king of England. They are the king or queen of the United Kingdom, which includes England, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland. But all of these kings and queens were kings and queens of England, even though some of them may have been also kings and queens of Scotland and other things. The only ones that wouldn't be separately king of England and king of Scotland would be any of the ones that come after 1800, and I'm guessing most of the ones on this list are going to be pre-unification. So if not, we're just going to overlook that argument over the title. Anyway, I'll put the link down in the description. The channel is called Brief History. I've also sat down and made my own list of who I believe, at least post William the Conqueror, so we're talking 1066 to the present, who I think the 10 worst would be in no particular order. And we're going to match up my list with the list that is presented here, which I haven't seen yet, and I'll share my thoughts about each one. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to thank Hunter in Roanoke, Virginia. Hunter signed up last month as a patron, and I am grateful for your support, Hunter. Let's dive in.
For centuries, and has been part of some of the most incredible events in its nation's history. But along the way, some of the monarchs in power fell short of expectations and diminished the reputation of the institution as a whole. Join me as I take a look at the top 10 worst kings and queens of England.
Windsor. I think that, yeah, it was Windsor.
We begin our list of the worst
Dishonorable
English kings and
mentions
queens with a couple dishonorable mentions, starting with King Charles I. Charles has gone down in history as being a particularly poor ruler.
See, Charles I is one of my bottom 10. I mean, any ruler who gets into it so much with your own kingdom that they end up arresting and trying and executing you, I think probably qualifies you in the bottom 10.
He was absolutist in nature, believing in the so-called divine rights of kings to rule without any form of checks and balances.
And it's important to note he was not the only king who felt that way. The problem was that by the time he comes along, when you're in the 17th century, sticking to that divine right of kings and I can do what I want because I'm the monarch just was, he wasn't reading the room. He couldn't get away with that the way that his predecessor Henry VIII had done generations before.
Note early on in his youth of the difficult relationship his father James I had with his parliament. When Charles came to power at 25 years of age in the year 1625, he wasn't about to let the same thing happen to him. However, he quickly found that controlling the English Parliament, who had by that time established itself as a force to be reckoned with politically, would indeed be a difficult task for him to take on. The result was a devastating sequence of civil wars in Scotland, England, and Ireland.
Civil wars that, if you look at the casualties in those wars, were incredibly bloody in terms of the percentage of the population that died in those wars. It's, by today's standards, the casualty numbers don't seem that high, but for the UK, Great Britain at that time, Scotland and England, which are two separate realms still, it was horrible.
Led to much death and destruction. Charles showed himself often to be duplicitous in his negotiations and continuously tried to connive behind the scenes to try and find ways of seizing control and or exacting taxes without parliamentary consent. In the end, after a long and drawn-out conflict, he was defeated by the English parliamentarians and beheaded in 1649, which brought forth the interregnum and protectorate periods in England.
Yeah, so, I mean, even Henry VIII, while really kind of ruling as an absolutist monarch, still, at least in practice, used Parliament to get what he wanted. Yes, he kind of was able to force his will on Parliament, but even he didn't go around Parliament to try and get stuff done. If he wanted taxes, he had Parliament pass it. If he wanted somebody to be executed, he had Parliament pass a bill a bill of attainder to make it possible to do that. So he used Parliament.
England.
Charles just went
Our
around
next
them.
dishonorable mention is William II, aka William Rufus.
All right.
William was said to have been an unpopular king, although he wasn't particularly unsuccessful in his military or political endeavors. Many believe that he was a sexually deviant king who was prone to all sorts of vice and excess. Questions remain as to the validity of these statements due to the contentious nature that Rufus had with the church in his day. When the Archbishop of Canterbury in William Rufus's time, Lanfranc, died, Rufus seized the church revenues until there came a time when he thought that he would die due to a sickness.
Yeah, I mean, this was an ongoing thing for centuries, the kings and their struggle with the church, because the church kind of existed outside of the authority of the temporal monarch until Henry VIII came along and decided that wasn't going to happen anymore.
He hastily appointed a man named Anselm to this role, who would eventually go on to be canonized as a saint in the church. Rufus recovered, and he and Anselm immediately set about battling over secular and religious matters to the point that Anselm was forced into exile. Whether the accusations of sexual deviancy were true or whether they were the result of a church establishment simply blackening the name of a king they detested can never be truly known. But nonetheless, Rufus would ultimately be killed while hunting in the New Forest when a stray arrow...
Yeah, it was a hunting accident.
...struck him in the chest. The clerics of the day, of course, interpret this as divine punishment, and perhaps this was an indication that he had few friends that he could trust. We begin our list at number 10 with King Stephen.
I have Stephen on my list. I mean, there's obviously going to be at least one of their top 10 that's not in my 10, since I had Charles I on my list and they did not in their 10.
Stephen takes the spot mainly due to his ineptitude as a king and his inability to rule properly. He, being the grandson of William the Conqueror and nephew of his predecessor Henry I, was not the designated heir to the throne at the time of his accession,
right,
which means that to some, he is viewed as a usurper. Instead, it was his cousin, a woman known to history as Empress Matilda, that had been designated as the heir to her father Henry I.
And she's called Empress Matilda because she had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor.
Civil war ensued after Stephen seized the throne, a conflict that has come to be known today as the Anarchy. Stephen was not considered particularly competent as a king and did much to offend the nobility that he needed support from. This led to Stephen ultimately losing strong allies from his nobility to his opponent Empress Matilda, thereby bringing forth a deadlock in the Anarchy conflict.
Yeah, so he ends up reigning for close to 20 years, but never really in an era of peace, and always with the threat of Matilda. And Matilda eventually, her descendants will be on the throne forever after. I mean, every monarch after Matilda is a descendant of Matilda all the way through to the modern day.
He was at one point captured by Matilda's forces, but was saved by the actions of his capable queen, also named Matilda. Although Stephen would be freed after his capture, he would never fully regain all of England under his control and would be forced to accept Matilda's son, Henry, as his successor.
And that's the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty.
In at number 9, we have James II. James had great kingly potential in that he, along with his elder brother and predecessor...
You'll notice a lot of these kings, a lot of these monarchs end up being usurped. In fact, if I'm looking at my list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9... of the monarchs on my list, all of them were either usurped or did not pass the throne down to a child of theirs, with the exception of John, who was in the process of being usurped when he was when he died.
Sir Charles II returned the Stuart dynasty to the English throne after being exiled by Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians following his father Charles I's defeat in the English Civil Wars. Unfortunately, by this time, England, after the reigns of the tumultuous Tudors and the interregnum period, had become a firmly Protestant Anglican nation. James II converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, and this ultimately led to his downfall.
So this is so complicated to talk about, obviously, because on one hand you can say, well, good for him that even though he knew it could very likely cost him his crown, he was still willing to stick to his Catholic faith. The other way of looking at it, of course, is to say, well, he was foolish enough to convert to Catholicism at a time when he knew it would cost him his crown.
Despite multiple attempts to remove him from the succession by many in Parliament, James remained as heir and inherited the English throne in 1685. Although he had a strong support structure in the form of the Loyalist Tory political party, he blundered this strength away by attempting to bring back Roman Catholicism to many institutions in England.
Again, a failure to read the room. He didn't realize that at this point that ship had sailed and England was not going back to Catholicism as the state religion.
Allowed his eldest daughter Mary and her husband, James's nephew and Dutch stadtholder William of Orange, to mount a successful invasion of England, which is affectionately remembered by many in Britain today as the Glorious Revolution. With many of James' initial supporters deserting him, he was forced into exile in France, where he remained for the rest of his life after being decisively defeated at the Battle of the Boyne by William of Orange in his attempts to retake the throne.
So the Battle of the Boyne is in Ireland, and I wanted to go to that battlefield, didn't get a chance when I was there, but this is where you get the Jacobites from. If you've ever heard of the Jacobites, the Jacobite succession, this is James. Jacob is I think it's the Latin word for James, name for James. And so the descent from the line, who would really be the senior line, were Catholicism not something that barred people from the throne, would be the Jacobite succession. And the guy who has the title of Duke of Bavaria, even though Bavaria doesn't have royal dukes anymore, is the current heir to the Jacobite succession.
At number 8, we have Mary I.
Yep, on my
Mary,
list.
being the daughter of the infamous Henry VIII, did not have a particularly easy life. She was bullied and intimidated by her father into accepting his supremacy over the Church of England after he broke from the Catholic Church in his attempt to attain a divorce from Mary's mother. However, Mary's dedication to the old Roman Catholic faith remained, and upon her accession, she became determined to bring England back under the spiritual
Bloody
dominion
Mary.
of Rome. Unfortunately, by this time, England had already accepted the Reformation to a degree, and much of the populace simply wanted the religious settlement to remain as it had under her father.
And now, a couple of things about this. Number one, Henry considered himself to be Catholic. He just didn't consider himself to be a Catholic who was under the authority of the Pope in Rome. So basically what he wanted was a Church of England that was still Catholic, but not papist, so to speak. Whereas Mary wanted to be loyal to the church in Rome and wanted to restore England to that. Well, in between her father and her reign, you have her younger brother, Edward VI, who is firmly Protestant. And he moves the bar enough to where by the time Mary comes along, she's got to try and push it back the other way. And she does so in particularly bloody fashion. But understand that under Edward, her brother, Catholics had been persecuted, and under Elizabeth, her sister, who would come after her, Catholics would be often persecuted. So it does kind of go both ways. And Mary is married to Philip, the King of Spain, and had they managed to have a child, you could end up with Spain and England united under one crown.
Mary, in order to forcibly impose her religious will, began burning Protestants as heretics, which would ultimately lend her the nickname she has long been remembered for, Bloody Mary. With the loss of Calais on the continent, the last toehold that England had after their loss in the 100 Years' War, and the unpopular marriage to the Spanish King Philip II, Mary reached new levels of unpopularity within her kingdom. Nonetheless, Mary's reign was short, as she died in 1558 after only 5 years on the English throne.
Yeah, she was in her 40s, had probably ovarian cancer, some kind of abdominal cancer there that, at least in her mind for a while, actually tricked her into thinking she was pregnant because of the symptoms she was having and things like that. It turned out to be cancer. Part of the reason why she's remembered as Bloody Mary, but we don't remember, for example, her brother Edward as Bloody Edward for persecuting Catholics, is because there was a really good propaganda job done during and after her reign by people like Fox, who did Fox's Book of Martyrs, where they published these stories of these Protestant martyrs who died for their faith, and they made them very popular figures, which meant making her kind of the demonic figure in that case. Still, I agree she's one of the bottom 10. Who else we got?
Coming in at number 7, we have Henry III. Henry came to the throne during tumultuous and chaotic times as the final stages of the First Barons' War were playing out. Being young, he wasn't truly included in the major decision-making that ended that conflict, but his youth caused him to develop a propensity towards relying on others very early on. As he aged, this feeling was exacerbated as he began to scandalously show favor towards some of his foreign step-siblings, the French Lusignans, and some of his wife's foreign relatives, the Savoyards. In allowing these foreign family members great favor and freedom above the law, Henry enraged his English nobility, which would eventually come to be led by Simon de Montfort. The Second Barons' War ensued, which saw Henry defeated in battle multiple times and ultimately being captured by the rebels.
So remember, Henry's coming in the aftermath of his father, King John. He's a child when he ascends to the throne, so he's in his minority, and there's regents for a while. They've come through a big struggle between the monarch and the barons, which culminates in things like Magna Carta, and John being in the process of being overthrown by a French king who was brought to England to take over, only for John to die right as that's happening. But I think by the time Henry finishes his reign, he has stabilized some of that. And I just don't personally think that while he wasn't a great king, I don't think he's bottom 10 for me.
He was only saved when his son, the future Edward I, defeated Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham and carried Henry to safety. Henry, despite being a pious man, was considered by many to be a fool, as he lacked the ability to focus on important issues or make difficult decisions unaided.
And he's one of the longest reigning monarchs in the history of the realm as well.
At number 6, we have Edward VIII. Edward, the uncle.
When I did my tier ranking, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can see the video I did several years ago where I did a tier list of all of them. I think I probably put Edward in like the inconclusive category because he's monarch for less than a year. He's monarch at a time when the monarch doesn't have necessarily as much power and influence as they once did, but I can see the argument being made here, and I do have him on my bottom 10.
Uncle of Queen Elizabeth II and brother of King George VI, was set to rule England as king since the time of his birth. However, despite the fact that he had a charming personality and a charismatic nature, he developed a detestation for his role as heir apparent to the British throne. He would ultimately...
This is a guy who had all the gifts that could have made him a great king if he had just wanted to be. If he had the sense of devotion and duty that his brother Albert, who becomes George VI, had, he could have been a great king because he's super charismatic, he's well-liked, he's at ease with other heads of state. He's very gifted in a lot of ways that his younger brother is not, and yet his younger brother was a great king.
His position as king shortly after assuming the crown in the year 1936 in order that he could marry his lover, the American socialite Wallis Simpson. In the wake of his abdication, Edward made life difficult for a successor and younger brother Albert, who became George VI.
And I will say this, it's good for the UK that Edward did not remain on the throne because he was very pro-Nazi, cozied up to Hitler quite a bit, and that could have, when you consider George VI and what a rock he was during World War II, his brother would have been so different.
Cajoling with and subtly supporting the Nazis after they came to power in Germany, while also refusing to remain out of the public limelight. During World War II, he exhibited a defeatist mindset and was said to have cared more for himself and Wallis Simpson than for the country at large.
Yeah, probably so.
Coming in at number 5, we have George IV.
Interesting. So that means that at least one more of the people on my list did not make it into their list, and I'm guessing it's going to be Richard the Lionheart is not in their bottom 10 because a lot of people disagree with me on that one. George IV, interesting. All right.
Son of King George III, the king who had lost the American colonies in the American Revolutionary War. George IV was known to have been an unbelievable spender, lavishly updating residences to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of pounds in 18th and 19th century dollars.
Yeah, it's fair to say that he's another example of a monarch who really didn't read the room when it comes to how he lived as a monarch. He's kind of living this lavish lifestyle, but he also had been, he's only monarch, I think, for 10 years. 1820, when his father dies, he becomes King George IV, but of course he had been Prince Regent for a long time before that because of his father's mental health issues. But yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that George doesn't really add anything of value as monarch. I just don't think he qualifies for the 10 worst for me.
Parliament was often forced to pay his exorbitant debts, at which point he would simply spend more and rack up more liabilities. He was also known for being emotionally unhinged at times, to the point that some believed that he had inherited some of the mental disorder that his father had so famously displayed during his life. This emotional instability came through most clearly in his dealings with women, as he often promised great things to many an unsuspecting woman, only to pull the rug out from under them and desert them. He married bigamously, connived against his king father when his father was experiencing a bout of his mental illness, and was an all-around unpopular king, prince, and regent all his life.
All right.
At number 4, we have Edward II.
Yeah,
Edward,
definitely.
son of the famous King Edward I, known as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots, was never thought to have had a kingly disposition.
Yeah. Edward II not only was not a good king himself, but he is sandwiched in between his father and his son, who were both among the greatest kings England ever had, which makes him look even worse.
From an early age, he exhibited signs that he would most likely not fit well into the role of ruler. Indeed, when his father died on his way to fight once again against Scotland, Edward wasn't able to pick up his banners and lead his troops to success over the Scots. He was famously defeated by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, which was followed by widespread famine and criticism. Edward was also a king known for the favoritism he exhibited towards some of his companions, which led many to speculate that these relationships were homosexual in nature.
In fact, if you watch a movie like Braveheart, for example, you see kind of a fictionalized version of the relationship between Edward II and Piers Gaveston. Piers is the name of the character that Edward I throws out the window, which isn't what happened, though the real Piers Gaveston did eventually get executed because of his undue influence on the king. Whether or not there was a sexual relationship, I tend to think probably not, but I can see why people think maybe there was.
Piers Gaveston and the Despensers were the favorites of Edward II that caused the most trouble, although at different times throughout Edward's life. Edward could be particularly cruel and petty in his dealings with his nobility, who opposed the power and corruption that Edward and his favorites exerted over them. Ultimately, Edward was defeated by his wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who captured, deposed, and ultimately killed Edward in 1327.
And despite what you read about how Edward II died, it was not by them shoving a red-hot poker into his rear end. That was a later story that was told that was probably based in part on the notion that he and Piers Gaveston were gay lovers. He was most likely just starved to death, or maybe even like smothered with a pillow or something. He wasn't murdered that way.
In at number 3, we have Richard II.
Yep.
Richard was the grandson of Edward III and the son of Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince.
So I'm just going to throw it out here now. I'm going to guess that Henry VI and John are the two that are left after this. I mean, they have to be. There's no way you have a bottom 10 list without Henry VI and without John. Richard II is another example of a guy who had great potential but didn't live up to it and, in fact, made all the wrong choices, at least later on in his reign.
Being forced to inherit the throne at a very young age due to the death of his father, Richard became isolated as a ruler, which pushed him towards detested favorites that his nobility despised.
So Richard is the son of Edward the Black Prince. If you've ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale, you see a fictionalized version of the Black Prince played by James Purefoy. Black Prince is the son of Edward III. He would have been Edward IV had he not died the year before his father, King Edward III. And so then the throne passed from Edward III to his grandson, Richard II, who, again, like Henry III, was a child when he comes to the kingship. And early on, even as a teenager, when he starts to take on real authority, he demonstrates some really good qualities and some abilities that, had they been properly harnessed, could have led to him being a great king. But he just chose a different path.
Although he was put in his place politically by a group of noblemen called the Lords Appellant,
Yep.
which included Richard's
Uncles.
cousin, the future Henry IV, he was eventually able to gain back kingly power over time. Once this happened, Richard became ever more tyrannical and absolute in his rule, which caused many to fear and detest him as he aged. Richard would ultimately be defeated by his cousin Henry of Lancaster, the future Henry IV, who had been banished to the continent by Richard, but who made a successful push back into England to seize the throne. Richard
There were so many opportunities where if he had just made a different choice, he could have held on to his throne and even probably strengthened his rule. I think Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, or Henry of Lancaster, could have been a strong ally for him had Richard played his cards right. But Richard was so, I think, threatened by other powerful people within his family, because Edward III had made all these royal dukes, and it ended up creating a whole bunch of royal family members with a lot of power, including guys like John of Gaunt, who was Edward III's brother, Henry IV's father. And so Henry Bolingbroke gets banished from England, and when his father, John of Gaunt, dies, Henry expects to inherit the title of Duke of Lancaster, and instead Richard's like, no, you got to stay banished, sorry, and that was the final straw for Henry. And so that was just one of a number of really poor decisions that Richard II made that cost him his throne.
Was captured at Flint Castle and transferred to Pontefract, where he was eventually starved to death by his cousin Henry IV.
Henry VI?
The number 2 monarch on the list of worst English kings and queens is Henry VI. Henry VI, coming to the throne as a young boy after the premature death of his father.
Notice a common theme with a lot of these guys. Richard II, Henry VI, Henry III was one they had on their list. These are people who came to the throne as children, and in the case of Henry VI, also mental illness.
Henry V was plagued throughout his life by his inability to rule properly and his mental disorder. Henry was a pious individual and was thought to have been somewhat morally upright, but this did not always translate well into the role of king. He, like many other monarchs on this list who are reflected poorly, utilized favorites in some of his important decision-making, which angered many nobles of the realm.
I think there is, to me, a difference, though, between a guy like Henry VI and, say, Richard II or Charles I or even John, who were actively bad kings, or even, you might argue, not good people. Henry VI, I think, was just in way over his head. He was just incompetent, and a lot of that had to do with his mental illness.
Henry was king of England when the 100 Years' War was lost for good, and this is thought to have possibly been the catalyst for the mental decline that Henry is often remembered for.
Yeah, in fact, Henry, when he becomes king, he's not only made king of England, he's king of France, because his father, Henry V, had finally won that inheritance right, which is what the whole 100 Years' War had been over in the first place, was the English king's claim on the French throne.
Henry, suffering a mental breakdown, became mute and unable to speak or rule for extended periods of time, which brought forth great turmoil in the interim. This would ultimately spell the outbreak of a conflict that we know today as the Wars of the Roses, as Henry's House of Lancaster battled with Edward IV's House of York over the throne. Henry, despite being deposed and reinstated again, would ultimately be deposed one final time and met his end at the hands of the Yorkists in the Tower of London in 1471.
Yep. Murdered. John. Gotta be John.
Coming in at number 1, the worst king of England, we have King John. John, the youngest son of Henry II and younger brother to Richard I, has been remembered poorly throughout the centuries for many reasons. Despite allegedly being his father's favorite son, he betrayed his father at the end of his father's life by siding with his brother Richard, who was warring with their father at the time.
That was such a dysfunctional family. I mean, in a world where there are a lot of dysfunctional royal families, there are a few that were as dysfunctional as that one. Just horrible. And they call him John Lackland because he had these older brothers in Richard I and Geoffrey, and these men who had great territories that they controlled, and John had nothing like that.
This was said to have caused Henry, who was sick at the time, such despair that he died as a result of it. John also connived against his brother Richard I when Richard was off on crusade by attempting to make deals with the French king at the time, Philip Augustus, which was to see large swaths of English-controlled territory in Normandy ceded to the French. When John inherited the throne, he was said to have been inept and particularly cruel, oftentimes oppressing his closest friends and confidants, which included at one time killing family members of those former friends in dungeons by starvation.
Yep.
John was responsible for the loss of major territory.
Supposedly, John actually, with his own hands, murdered his nephew, who had a stronger claim on the English throne than he did.
On the continent, which were swallowed up by the more powerful and adept French rulers at that time. He also taxed exorbitantly whether military conflict was at hand or not, and this, unsurprisingly, led to detestation from his baronage. When John did engage in military campaigns, as he did when he attempted to retake land on the continent from the French, he was almost always unsuccessful in his attempts, oftentimes withdrawing from conflict, which caused many to think him a coward. Due to his detestable nature, his baronage exerted their will and finally forced John to agree to the terms of a famous document known as Magna Carta, which attempted to lay out proper rule that a king should follow. Unsurprisingly, John, after signing, simply disregarded the agreement, which ultimately led to further conflict and the outbreak of the First Barons' War. John, dying of gastrointestinal issues in 1216, was still embroiled in
also lost the crown jewels that are still out there somewhere in the Wash in eastern England.
Conflict at the time of his death, and there were few, if any, who mourned his loss.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I've got no major issues with that list. I mean, like I said, I already kind of expressed some of my disagreements with it, but by and large, it was a good list, well presented. Like I said, I'll put in the description below a link to my tier maker list where I kind of sat down and went through all of the monarchs starting in 1066 and ranked them in tiers, talking about each one and why I put them where I did. Let me thank Terry in Santa Rosa, California, as well as Charlie in Hebburn in the UK for your support on Patreon. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.